The international community marked Human Rights Day this past Sunday, and in light of this occasion, we sit down today with the head of the UN Human Rights Office here in Seoul for his thoughts regarding the plight of ordinary people across the border in North Korea. It's good to have you with us. You're watching Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with the head of the UN Human Rights Office here in Seoul, Mr. James Heenan. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Sunny. It's great to be here.
Right. Now, for the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with your entity, could you give us some background information regarding its opening and, of course, as well as its objectives?
Sure, of course. We're a global organisation that works on human rights for the UN. We're a UN agency. Here in Seoul, we have a very specific mandate just to monitor the human rights situation in DPRK. We don't say North Korea, we say the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We monitor and we report on the human rights situation in DPRK, but we also have a particular mandate to gather information and evidence of possible crimes against humanity being committed in DPRK. And in addition to that, we have an overall job to keep the focus on human rights in DPRK, an advocacy role to try to keep the international focus on what's happening there.
Right, and you've been here for about a year now, a little
That's
over
right.
a year, I believe.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about your work over the past year?
Oh, well, it's been a busy year. I mean, first of all, adapting to a totally new context that I didn't know before, making the contacts with the government, the civil society and partners, understanding the context, which is 70 years or more of context. We've launched a major report on enforced disappearance, which is people who were forcibly disappeared into North Korea. We're preparing a major report on forced labour, which is where individuals are forced by the authorities to work against their will, essentially. We have started a number of consultations, a program of consultations with people, particularly victims of human rights violations in DPRK, to hear what they want. We in the UN adopt what we call a victim-centred approach. We try to focus on what the victims of violations want, what their views are, what their concerns are, and that's quite a large bit of work. We also do a lot of capacity building on criminal law, because what we're trying to do is build a basis for many people who are collecting information to make sure they collect it in a way that will ultimately be usable if there is a criminal trial somewhere.
Right, I see. And before we get into that then, Mr. Heenan, when people talk about, or activists talk about North Korea, the DPRK, as you said, having complete control over its people, what exactly do they mean?
Well, if I can put it in human rights terms, it's the easiest way maybe to explain. First of all, well, freedom of movement. People don't have the freedom to move outside DPRK, but even within the DPRK, you need permission to move not just provinces, but even your hometown. You don't have the right to go to Pyongyang, to the capital. It's very heavily policed. You can't come near the borders, so that sort of movement issue. The right to freedom of expression, clearly. We know that those who disagree with the authorities are seen as being enemies of the state and suffer greater human rights violations. There's a right to privacy issue, constant monitoring, including through neighbourhood committees in Manban, which monitor what people are doing in apartment blocks in towns and villages. Control over labour. You get a state-assigned job. You don't get the job you want to do. You have to follow what the state says in terms of work. You mightn't be paid for it. In fact, at the moment, you're unlikely to be paid for it. And then also just in terms of what you watch or what you enjoy. So the freedom of information, and I think it's well known that accessing things like K-drama, South Korean drama and so forth will get you in a lot of trouble in DPRK at the moment. So all of these things together, plus many more smaller constraints, mean that the people's freedom and liberty is constrained like almost nowhere else in the world.
There were reports about how North Korean peoples as young as teenagers being executed for watching South Korean drama. Have you heard of these reports, Mr. Heenan?
We've heard of those reports. I have to say we haven't verified them. We've heard of them. But even if they haven't been verified, we know that the law on reactionary information allows for punishment up to the level of execution for viewing or distributing foreign drama which is seen to be against the values of the state.
Are most of the reports drawn up by your office based on the stories of survivors?
Yeah, I mean, the sources of information that we use are essentially individuals who leave DPRK and come here. We call them escapees. The number of escapees we've interviewed, hundreds and hundreds. They have reduced in recent years because of the closures around COVID, but the numbers are on the rise again. But those people provide a very rare insight into what's happening in DPRK. We have other sources of information as well. And to be honest, a lot of the public information from the authorities tell us a lot about what's going on. For example, the laws make it very clear what the punishments are, but also public information suggesting that there might be a food issue in some province or so forth. There's a lot of information out there for us to use.
Right, and talking about information, a Seoul-based human rights organization, Mr. Heenan, I believe, recently raised much alarm about the vanishing, if I may, of some 600 North Koreans who were forced to return to their country by China. What do you suppose could be a possible fate that they face in their home country upon being repatriated?
Well, I mean, we've received this information as well, that a number of people, hundreds in fact, were potentially repatriated from China to the DPRK. This is nothing new. It's happened before. It's the numbers that had built up during COVID closures. So we ended up with a lot more people in detention and potentially being sent back. We know that people from the past, that people who are outside DPRK illegally, so outside without permission, so not diplomats or those people, but others who leave the country illegally, face certain measures when they come home or are forced to go home. These range from, at best, re-education, through prison time, through being sent to a political prison camp, and even, in some cases, even execution. The worst punishment is meted out to those who show an interest in coming to the Republic of Korea, or those who have certain religious beliefs, particularly Christians. So, yeah, we know the sorts of punishments they may have been subject to, but we don't know at the moment exactly what happened to them. And in fact, they may end up being classified as being forcibly disappeared.
And given that piece of information, is there no way to better persuade countries like China from forcibly repatriating North Korean defectors?
So I work for the United Nations. The United Nations is an organisation of member states. Member states including China, including DPRK, including the Republic of Korea. Now, this is part of an international system and of rules-based order, and part of those rules are human rights rules. These countries, all countries, have ratified some human rights conventions. So the question is to make sure and to urge countries to comply with their obligations. If you've ratified the Convention Against Torture, we will do what we can to urge you to comply with it. That involves public urging, but also private urging. Yeah, we in the UN have a privileged relationship with member states, so we also have a bilateral channel. So we urge member states, not just China, but all member states, to comply with their obligations. Our position in the United Nations is very clear. The High Commissioner, my boss, has said that those individuals in China and other countries at risk of being forcibly sent back to DPRK have a real risk of irreparable harm if they go back, a real risk of things like torture and arbitrary detention, and that they should be afforded immediate international or immediate protection. I guess if you zoom out, if you look at the root cause of all of this, the root cause of all of this is the treatment that the people will suffer in DPRK. The return is one of the problems, but the return is a problem because of what happens to them when they get back. So really, we're also urging DPRK to make sure that these individuals aren't tortured, make sure that these individuals aren't arbitrarily detained when they go home. So it's a fairly multifaceted phenomenon that we need to use all the tools in our toolbox, including public advocacy.
And beyond the hardships faced by these defectors, I understand that there are hardships, of course, faced by the children as well in North Korea, as well as the women there. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I mean, there's the entire population essentially is at risk of serious human rights violations. Women are at risk. We've done a lot of work on this. Women are at risk for more or less three reasons, three sorts of vulnerabilities. One is because of a very traditional patriarchal society. So, for example, the failure to address domestic violence in the country, in families, and that sort of thing, or the lack of women in leadership positions. A second one is because of the ideology of DPRK and the Juche ideology. Women are seen specifically as being, as they say, the wheels of the revolution. They're behind the men who are fighting for the revolution, and it's a fairly traditional view of women, which leaves them in the background, in the home, etc., and so forth. And the third vulnerability that women have is just as women. So things like sexual abuse in detention, when they're returned, what happens to them, the sort of invasive searches they suffer, the harassment in the markets, these sorts of things. So they're all phenomena that women are subjected to. Children, to be honest, is a less known area. We do work on that, but it's a less known area. Children, we know that they suffer from things like forced labour when they're forced into the fields during harvest time to help with the harvest and so forth. We know that they're not immune from being sent to prison camps or political camps. We know that they're punished often for the so-called crimes of their parents or even their grandparents. And under international law, children have special protections. They have more protections than the rest of us for obvious reasons. So the question is, are these protections being respected by DPRK? And I'm not sure they are.
And speaking about children and women, but extending beyond our current talk, Mr. Heenan, there is fresh speculation about the possibility of Kim Jong-un's daughter, Kim Jue, becoming the next leader. There is speculation that he is grooming her for succession, given the exposure that she has received in recent times with the media. Keeping in mind what you've told me about the status of women in North Korea, what do you believe, and I understand you're not an expert on this, but what do you believe are the prospects of having a female leader in North Korea? And would that change the plight of women there, do you think?
Well, I don't really know about the prospects because it's very opaque, it's very hard to tell, but I mean, in many countries, and all countries have been through this process really, it's like breaking the ceiling to have a female leader. In terms of, if not gender equality, then the image of gender equality, it's a very important message to show that women also are equally able to take on leadership roles. So in that way, I guess it would be a positive step. But there's many other factors involved in gender equality in North Korea beyond just who the leader is.
Right, of course, I'd have to agree with you there. The Yoon administration has placed quite a bit of priority on shedding greater light on North Korea's human rights violations, as well as, of course, its hostile weapons ambitions. Do you suppose, Mr. Heenan, the raising of awareness regarding such atrocities will ultimately serve to perhaps better address them in the future?
Yeah, I mean, in every context, every human rights crisis that we deal with, shining a light on violations is the first thing to do. It's a key part of addressing any human rights issue, particularly such a grave crisis as we have in DPRK. So the attitude of the government is welcome, to be very clear about what's happening there. It's not just about awareness raising, it's about making sure that awareness raising goes hand in hand with efforts to make a concrete change to people's lives. And that's our North Star, our guiding star is to try to make sure that whatever we do is aimed at improving the lives of people on the ground in DPRK. And that's quite a difficult thing in this context. I don't know many other contexts in the world where it's so difficult to we can't access the country, there's no independent civil society in the country, people don't come out of the country very much. it's a particular challenge. So in addition to advocacy, our challenge is to find these other means to improve people's lives. The advocacy also has another role. The advocacy puts people on notice that, for example, public officials who are involved in human rights violations, they know that people are watching. They know that people know what's going on, and they're fixed with knowledge, as we say. They can't later on say, oh, I didn't know about this. And that's why documenting human rights violations over time is very important. Some people get very frustrated, and not just on DPRK, but on many other places in the world. It feels like it takes so long to get a result in human rights. It's a very long-term process. But this slow, painstaking, sometimes frankly boring work of documenting what's going on for years, maybe decades, is incredibly important for accountability at the end, but also for restraining, as Martin Luther King said, restraining the heartless.
Right. And in the meantime, as we wait, Mr. Heenan, what more can an ordinary individual do, especially one based here in South Korea, to better address the plight of people in North Korea, do you think?
I get this question a lot. I mean, these days, it has to be said that the current state of the world, particularly in terms of human rights, is not good. We're facing a number of crises where not just human rights there's pushback on people's enjoyment of their rights, but even the notion of human rights. We even have people now questioning the notion that we all have human rights. And this is in the year of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration that we celebrated on Sunday. But the Declaration, if you read it, that we're all free and equal in rights and dignity, is as relevant today as it was in 1948. And the fact that people think that that's not a statement we should be aspiring for, that really concerns me, that people think that we're not all equal in rights and dignity. So people can get a bit overwhelmed by it because we also receive a lot of information through programs like this, but also social media and people, citizens in most countries, that are overwhelmed. What can I do? It's out of my control. I think my answer to that is that we all have a role to play in our daily lives, yeah? So when we're talking about human rights generally, we stand up for our own rights and we stand up for the rights of others. That's the key thing. If we turn a blind eye to someone else's human rights being violated, we're contributing to this lack of confidence in human rights. And that's what we try to promote. Stand up for your rights and stand up for the rights of others. In terms of people from the Republic of Korea and DPRK, people have different roles. Some people are very engaged in trying to send humanitarian relief to the north, or a lot of people here have family in the north. I think at the moment, from what I understand, there's a real need for people to be aware of what's happening in the north. There's a sense, a little bit, particularly amongst youth, maybe, in this country, to not want to focus on North Korea. It's too hard, it's too long-standing, it's too old. Let's just focus on other things. And once that happens, then we've got a real problem, I think. So one of the things we do is we work with universities and university students to try to keep the awareness of what's happening in North Korea, DPRK, and also to let particularly young people find their own way to contribute. So, for example, we had just this week, we had an art exhibition where we had 30, 40 young people expressing how they felt about human rights in North Korea through art. I mean, it might sound a little bit disconnected, but it's a very powerful way of raising awareness.
And of keeping the plight of North Koreans on the negotiating or conversation, that is. Exactly. Mr. Heenan, keeping in mind the recent geopolitical events across the globe, how far has the international community as a whole, do you suppose, come in terms of advancements with regard to human rights?
Well, exactly, and that's what I was referring to just now. There's a sense that things are going backwards, in this year of the 75th anniversary. I think sometimes it's difficult to zoom out because we're so consumed with what's happening right now. But personally, I think if you zoom out, the achievements of the human rights movement have been remarkable. Yeah? you just need to look at how human rights is prevalent, the human rights discourse is prevalent in most countries these days. Even 20, 30 years ago, I mean, there wasn't a lot of human rights discourse. You didn't have specialised human rights courses in universities and so forth. Now, widespread. This country is peculiar because you have a very strong human rights culture here because of your history. But in many other places, human rights has really blossomed in the last 30 years. In terms of on the ground, you know, you need to look at the huge strides in terms of the rights of women. Now, there's a long way to go, a long way to go. But I think it's night and day compared to even 20 or 30 years ago. The huge strides in the rights of persons with disabilities, which has totally flipped from being one of charity, where you provided basic needs for persons with disabilities out of some sort of charitable thing, and now it's flipped entirely into rights. We have a right to participate in society. On to the issue of LGBT. LGBT even 10 years ago was an issue that a lot of people didn't even want to talk about. Now, not only are people talking about it, but it's seen in terms of rights. So I think there's a lot, and they're just some examples. I think there's a lot of examples, but that doesn't mean we can take the foot off the gas, as the Americans would say. We need to keep fighting because there are new challenges coming up, the challenges of artificial intelligence, the challenges of the trans community and so forth. So, but I'm an optimist on that. I think as the High Commissioner, my boss, says, the phenomena we're facing now in terms of war and famine and AI, we know the solution to those require more human rights, not less. More human rights and not less.
And hence the relevance and role of your entity then. All right, James Heenan, the head of the UN Human Rights Office here in Seoul, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you, Sunny. Very nice.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye. Be sure to join us same time tomorrow for yet another edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for now.